Today I am continuing what I've been doing, and that is teaching through section 6 of Matthew's Gospel. So for those of you that have not been here, section 6 is roughly that point from where Jesus heals the blind men outside of Jericho, just before he enters Jerusalem, all the way through his sermon on the Mount of Olives about his return and all those kinds of things. So basically the end of chapter 20, all the way through to the end of chapter 25. That's section 6. That's what I've been teaching through. And I've titled this section, Jesus Pronounces Judgment Against Israel and Its Leaders, because for the most part, the things he says here are all themed around that, and the things he does here. This is very much his prophetic declaration against the city just before he is crucified. And I'm now, within that section 6, going through what I've outlined as the fourth portion of all that. So we've made it a good chunk of the way through that section 6. And basically, this fourth portion is Matthew 23. So basically all that chapter and only that chapter. And I've given this portion a title as well to give a summary of what I think is going on here. And I've titled this, The Heirs of Moses Guide the People to Condemnation, because this is where he really has a lot to say about the scribes and the Pharisees, and how he portrays them and what he says about them is very much along those lines. The heirs of Moses guide the people to condemnation. That's, I think, Jesus' summary of what he is saying about these men based on what they've been doing. And this portion is, of course, about the scribes and the Pharisees. It's actually 3 different warnings, all pertaining to the scribes and the Pharisees, but given to slightly different audiences as the chapter progresses. Now, I've been covering this first warning, so this is the first 12 verses of Matthew 23, so that gives you an idea of where we are in terms of what we've been doing here in Matthew. I'm going to go ahead and read this. This first warning is given to the crowds and the disciples about the scribes and the Pharisees. So here again, verses 1 through 12 of chapter 23. Says, Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and the Pharisees sat down in the chair of Moses. Therefore all that they tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds. For they say things and do not do them. For they tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men. For they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. They love the place of honor at banquets, and chief seats in the synagogues, and respectful greetings in the marketplaces, and being called Rabbi by men. But do not be called Rabbi, for one is your teacher, and you are all brothers. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. And do not be called leaders, for one is your leader, that is Christ. But the greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. So here Jesus describes the religion of me, as I have called it, practiced by the scribes and the Pharisees, because all that they do is framed around exalting themselves in the eyes of the people. And as I've talked about this warning here for a while, and I have 3 messages left, at least 3. There is just the slight chance that one of them will become 2 messages, so there might be 4. I reserve the right to alter my sermon plans as I see fit, but at least 3 more sermons based on this warning, each of them taking a small portion of it and just talking about it in more detail. Now, today's sermon is mostly the application for what I discussed last time about the phylacteries and the tassels mentioned by Jesus, and how the scribes and the Pharisees use their clothing for self-exaltation. So today is based on things I said last time, but very much making this more a matter of why this is a concern for us and what we should do with this information. And my sermon today is called Exaltation Without Decoration. And you should get used to that format, Exaltation Without blank, because the next 3 sermons are all titled like that. So that's the gimmick, I guess, of this particular set of sermons. But exaltation without decoration is what I'm calling this sermon. And according to Jesus, here in this passage, in this warning, we should seek exaltation not through appearances, but through humble service to one another. So there's a right way and a wrong way to seek exaltation, specifically from the hand of God. And you don't do that through appearances, through how you decorate yourself. You do that through humble service to one another. And my outline for today has 4 headings. As I talk about that, as I often do, I'll tell you what those are so you can follow along more carefully. First, as I explained in my most recent sermon, Jesus rebuked the scribes and the Pharisees for seeking exaltation through their religious apparel. And in this heading, I just want to summarize what I said last time very briefly, especially for those of you who are not here and might have questions about those things. Secondly, my second heading, I want to make the point that we should not bother defending our own overuse of religious apparel. So whatever objections you might have, I'm going to shut them down early in the sermon and just deal with them immediately so you can listen to what I have to say for the rest of the sermon. Thirdly, none of us should seek to appear more righteous than another through how we decorate ourselves. And this, of course, is the application of what Jesus says about the scribes and the Pharisees here. And then finally, last heading, we should instead seek exaltation through humble service. And that's another set of words you should get used to hearing, humble service, because that is where Jesus is really going with this first warning, and that's where my next few sermons are going as well. So, that's what we're doing today. Before we get started with all that, I have something I want to show you, and especially you children. I have some questions for you kids based on this that I'm going to show you. I have something here that I got years ago. There you go. You got a ribbon or a medal or whatever you want to call this. Good for me. So, as you kids, as you see this, when you see somebody wearing one of these or something like it, what is your first guess about this person? What do you think? They won first place at something. Okay, Selena, what were you going to say? Getting ahead of me there, aren't they? Okay, so Esther gave the answer that I was thinking about. When you see someone wearing this, your first guess is that they won something. They were given this by somebody to commemorate, their victory or their accomplishment, whatever it may be. Now, what if I told you that nobody gave me this medal, but I gave it to myself? I see some people snickering there. It's like, that'd be a silly thing to do. Why would you do that? It doesn't mean anything that way, right? If you just buy a medal and give it to yourself, it's like, why'd you even do that for? That'd be more like Selena's idea of just showing off. But in this case, you're not showing off much because you didn't do anything. You didn't do anything to get this, you just gave it to yourself. Well, the scenario I'm giving you is pretty silly, of course, and people don't normally give themselves medals like that. But they do something very similar. And that is actually what Jesus has in mind in this warning that we're talking about today. You see, the scribes and the Pharisees wore certain things, not necessarily medals, but things that would have the same idea. They wore certain things to make it look like God thought well of them, that they had some sort of special favor from God, and God was really in favor of them somehow. But really what they wore meant nothing. It's just stuff they decided to wear, and they're just trying to pass themselves off as something great. So that's what they were doing. Now, this sermon today is meant to help us think about that kind of thing and avoid making that kind of mistake, because it is possible to do that same kind of thing. It may not be a medal, and it may not be phylacteries or tassels or these other things that the scribes and the Pharisees were wearing, but it is possible to do that same kind of thing, to buy yourself a medal, so to speak, and wear it around to make yourself look like you're something great in the eyes of God when you're actually not. And that's actually what we're talking about today. So let's go ahead and get moving through these things, starting with my first heading here, which again is more of a review from last time. As I explained in my most recent sermon, Jesus rebuked the scribes and the Pharisees for seeking exaltation through religious apparel, through clothing that looks religious, basically. They're seeking exaltation by what they wear. Now, the examples given by Jesus here, there's 2 of them. The first example he gives is their broad phylacteries. Now, phylacteries are these small cases containing scripture texts worn on the left arm and on the forehead for religious purposes by the Jews, right? So that's basically what we're talking about when we say these phylacteries. It's not something we see very much, although Jews do wear them today at their prayer meetings. In modern times, the phylacteries are worn during the weekday morning prayer meetings held by the Jews. So if you ever come into contact with an Orthodox Jew, you might actually see these from time to time. Even if you're not at their prayer meetings, you might see them somehow. Now, these phylacteries are worn because of an overly literal application of 4 commands from the law of Moses. There are passages, 4 of them in the law of Moses, where he talks about binding something on your arm, on your hands, and on your forehead. And basically, the literal application of that they came up with was actually writing down pieces of scripture, putting them in boxes, strapping the boxes to their body, and that's how they're going to fulfill this command. And we don't know exactly when Jews started wearing phylacteries. We don't have a certain time when that began, but we do know the practice can be dated confidently back as far to those centuries just before the time of Jesus, because we have found phylacteries from that time. So we know that the Jews were making them and wearing them. Within a century or so of Jesus, they were doing this. Now, as for the scribes and the Pharisees in the time of Jesus, they had a habit of trying to outdo other worshipers by wearing especially broad phylacteries. So presumably all the Jews were wearing these, or many of the Jews were wearing these as part of their worship. But the Pharisees and the scribes, they make really big phylacteries. They make broad ones. So they make their cases bigger, or maybe the straps bigger or whatever, just to take up more space and to be more noticeable as they're meeting together with other Jews for prayer. And so that's what they were doing, and Jesus calls them out for that. Now, later rabbis made the effort to end the self-exalting use of unique and eye-catching phylacteries. We know that because of things that were written down later. Other rabbis came along and said that this kind of thing should not be done. So indirectly, those rabbis vindicated the teaching of Jesus. It took a while for them to come to those conclusions, but eventually they basically came to the same conclusions and said, okay, these phylacteries, everyone wear the same thing. Stop trying to show off. Stop trying to look super holy in the prayer meetings by wearing big phylacteries or golden phylacteries or any of the other kinds that they were wearing later on. So that's the first example Jesus talks about, these phylacteries, the Pharisees and the scribes making these broad phylacteries to show themselves off. The other example given by Jesus of seeking exaltation through religious apparel is the long tassels being worn by the scribes and the Pharisees. You see that also here right next to the phylacteries in verse 5 in chapter 23. Now this tassel that he's talking about with its blue cord was meant to be a reminder to the Hebrews that they needed to obey the commandments of God. This was a visible reminder to them when they looked at themselves or looked at other people that they needed to obey the commands of God. And the source for this practice is an actual command from the law of Moses. Last time we went back to the book of Numbers, we actually saw that command. Unlike with the phylacteries, which I think is an overly literal, misguided application, this is something that was actually told to them to do. They actually were told this by God, wear these tassels as a reminder to obey God. Now, after the Old Testament, the next clear reference we have to these things is what Jesus says here in Matthew 23, where he accuses them of wearing long tassels for the sake of being noticed by other people. And here we see that they're again trying to outdo other people. All the other Jews are presumably wearing these tassels because it's commanded by the law of Moses, but these guys want to wear long tassels. They want to make it clear, hey, we are really taking this seriously. So they're really trying to show off quite a bit there in wearing these longer tassels. And then last time, as I said, very much like with the phylacteries, there was a later effort by rabbis to standardize the length of tassels so that everyone was wearing the same length, which stops people from using them to exalt themselves in the way the scribes and the Pharisees were doing. So again, later judgments by rabbis actually vindicate Jesus on this point. So for both of these things, with the phylacteries and the tassels, Jesus was actually vindicated in his rebuke against the scribes and the Pharisees for seeking exaltation through religious apparel. It took a little while longer for the rest of the nation to figure that out, but eventually they said, yeah, we need to stop doing this. People need to stop showing off through their phylacteries and their tassels. And that is what I talked to you about last time. I gave a lot more detail on all that, maybe more than you actually wanted, but I wanted to be sure you understood these things. And that was what I said last time. Now, for my second heading today, I want to make the point that we should not bother defending our own overuse of religious apparel. So this is where it gets more into your life and what this all means for you. And I want you to consider for a moment what sort of defense the scribes and the Pharisees might have made for themselves against this rebuke from Jesus. Because they just didn't take this lying down. I mean, Jesus is up there defaming them in front of the whole nation. They're going to have some kind of response to this. It's not recorded for us, but I think we can make a guess as to how they would have responded. Most likely they would have argued that wearing such flamboyant apparel was good and right somehow. They would have made some kind of argument that they were justified and maybe it was a good thing to wear the broad phylactery and the long tassel. They probably would have insisted that such apparel reflected their own genuine commitment to God, which was allegedly greater than that of other people. They would have said, hey, I wear the broad phylactery, I wear the long tassel because I take my devotion to God very seriously. They probably would have made that argument. Also, they might have argued that larger phylacteries and longer tassels could have provoked other people to greater devotion to God. They might have argued that other people seeing them with these bigger, better phylacteries and tassels might have had a positive effect on other people, provoking them to take their commitment to God seriously. Such are the arguments that the scribes and the Pharisees might have made. I'm pretty certain they made some kind of argument, and I'm pretty sure that it would have fallen along those lines. One of those two, maybe both of those two. Now, I'm sure those kinds of arguments would have sounded very good to the scribes and the Pharisees, and maybe even other people as well. After all, there's some logic to that, you might say. Jesus, however, does not care. He just keeps going on with this rebuke. He doesn't even stop to deal with exceptions to the rule, as though maybe some scribes and some Pharisees really are genuine in their doing of these things. He doesn't even bother with that possibility. Christ just says, dogmatically, firmly, that this flamboyant religious apparel is a play for notoriety among the people of God. They do it to be noticed by men, period, end of discussion. No, you don't get a rebuttal. Just, that's it. That's all there is to it. This is apparently one of the ways I think that the heart can be deceitfully wicked. Because if Jesus is right about this, then a person could be making all these protests saying, oh, that's not why I wear this phylactery. That's not why I wear these long tassels. I really mean this in some good way. And he might be saying that, but he's deceived himself within his heart. Because according to Jesus, the only reason to do this is to seek notoriety among other people. So here's your heart tricking you, or the heart of the scribes and the Pharisees in particular, in this case, tricking them maybe into thinking this is justifiable, when in reality it's not. It's just a sin, and Jesus is prophetically calling them to account for their sin in this way. So these broad phylacteries and long tassels were, period, a symptom of a self-exalting spirit, even if the scribes and the Pharisees did not know that about themselves. Even if they did protest this, even if they did make arguments, it doesn't matter. This is the truth about them, that they are doing these things to exalt themselves, even if they have deceived themselves into thinking the opposite. Now, this is important for us to remember as we apply the words of Jesus, as we think about these things for our own life and try to figure out how this matters to us. We need to remember this. We too could make excuses for our own efforts at self-exaltation. We could be doing things very much like the scribes and the Pharisees, might be making arguments to justify ourselves, much like they would have made. But against that, we need to remember how firmly Jesus rebukes this practice among them. We might want to argue, that our fashion choices, our religious fashion choices, are simply the overflow of our devotion to God. We might want to argue that our distinct religious apparel has a positive effect on people around us. We might want to make those arguments if anyone ever confronts us in this kind of way about things we wear. But in either case, we would be disregarding the truth of the matter, which is that we wear such things to exalt ourselves. The heart is deceitfully wicked even now. In 2,000 years, that hasn't changed. There's still very much a possibility of deceiving yourself, and I think we need to take this firm rebuke that Jesus gives here with no exceptions and apply that to ourselves just as strictly, and treat any such flamboyance in our own apparel anything like that, we need to treat it the same exact way that Jesus treated it in the scribes and the Pharisees. We need to just disregard any arguments we might make to the contrary, not bother defending ourselves, and just take this thing exactly as Jesus lays it out here, as a play for notoriety. So, that is the conclusion that I've reached on this, and is the foundation for everything else I'm about to say. So here we go. My third heading, the great application of this rebuke from Jesus to the scribes and the Pharisees, this time applying it to us and thinking about how we should dress or decorate ourselves, not decorate ourselves rather. And the application is, very simply, that none of us should seek to appear more righteous than another through how we decorate ourselves. We shouldn't be, putting religious medals around ourselves for some reason. We shouldn't be doing any of that. We should not try to appear more righteous than another through those kinds of things. Now, if I'm right about this, the possibilities for sin here are as numerous as our options for clothing and accessories. So there's a lot of variation possible here. I mean, every year they come out with some new thing you could possibly wear, and I suppose that eventually some of these things could be misused by the people of God in the ways that the scribes and the Pharisees were misusing their phylacteries and their tassels. But the matter becomes very simple if only we remember to look around us and mark what the general church crowd is wearing and try not to outdo what everyone else is wearing. That is my basic rule of thumb here that has guided my application of these things. As long as we all look very similar in terms of what we wear or what we're not doing with ourselves, as long as we're all doing basically the same thing, no one can show off, right? If we're all wearing the same size phylactery, if we're all wearing the same size tassel, none of us can be showing off in that way. None of us can be pushing ourselves as more holy than the rest of us. And that's basically the same idea that I have as I'm going through all of these things here. So I just wanted to give a few examples that I came up with of things that might be done wrong by Christians in this way. So my first example is an obvious one. The use of Christian t-shirts or Christian clothing, things that have Christian wording or pictures on them, things like that. Now, I suppose it's no sin to wear a Christian-themed t-shirt. After all, a great many Christians wear shirts like that. I've owned more than one in my time. I know I don't wear shirts with things on them very much anymore, but I used to. I used to do that, and a lot of Christians do. It's very, very common for Christians to have things like that. But let's say I wore a Christian t-shirt every single day, that you never saw me unless I'm wearing an actual Christian t-shirt, and that's pretty much all I have. All of my clothing, Christian t-shirts, all day, every day. Such a thing would be very unusual, and it would have a self-exalting effect. I would be known as the guy who always wears the Christian t-shirts. I'd be standing out from the crowd in that way, and I would have some sense notoriety for that. Whether good or bad, people would look at me that way and think of me as the guy who stands out for that reason. There is a kind of self-exalting effect to that, especially among people that value wearing things like those kinds of t-shirts and everything. So there's a way this might play out in our own day. Another example that I thought of, and I mentioned this somewhat last time, but I want to bring it up again, the apparel that sports the letters WWJD. What would Jesus do? And I mentioned this in the prior sermon, of course, the old trend for wearing apparel with WWJD on it. As a reminder, of course, to do what Jesus would do in any given situation. Now, I suppose if some Christian wore a bracelet on his wrist, WWJD there, I suppose it would not be very much a violation of what Christ has said, because a lot of people do that. A lot of Christians, at least back when I was younger, would wear those things. I don't know if it's so common anymore, but it was common for that to happen, people wearing things with WWJD on it to remind them, to do what Jesus would do. That's pretty common. But what if I wore a neon-colored headband, with WWJD on it, just big here on my forehead, and I just walked around wearing that all the time, right? And you know me as the guy who wears the brightly colored WWJD headband. Well, if I did that, that would be unusual. In more ways than one, it would be unusual. But if I did that, I'd become known as that guy. He's the guy that wears the WWJD on his forehead all the time. in a very conspicuous way. Those kinds of things could be like a broad phylactery or a long tassel, very much exalting yourself as like, I take it seriously. Like I'm a serious disciple of Jesus. You just write it in tiny letters on your wrist. I put it on my forehead. It's like that. It could have that kind of effect, right? Exalting yourself above others as being more serious in doing what Jesus would do. So there's another example that might be a way people would apply this and do the wrong thing in this case. My next example would probably do more to make certain Christians uncomfortable. Not all Christians by any means, but some Christians. And that is ministerial uniforms. The idea of clergymen, to use that term, wearing special clothing because of what they are. Now, as I consider this teaching from Jesus, it just makes me less comfortable about the practice of some Christians to have their ministers wear the special clothing that they very often wear. To the point where if you go to a church somewhere, you can tell immediately who the minister is there, whoever the pastor is or the priest or whatever they call that particular person, you can tell by their clothing. And when I say special clothing, I don't merely mean the black outfit and white collar of a priest. I don't mean just the long robes worn by some other ministers. Those are certainly examples of what I'm talking about, probably the most noteworthy examples. But what about the wearing of a suit and tie? Because if there's a lot of churches, if you step into that church, there's only one man wearing a suit and tie, and it's the preacher. And he's the only one that wears that. And it's assumed that the preacher ought to wear a suit and tie in a lot of churches. Well, isn't that the same kind of thing as what these other guys are wearing? You're wearing something to make you look distinct from everyone else there in the church. Now, Christians have always made arguments in favor of ministerial uniforms. For as long as they've been doing that, there have been arguments about that, about it conferring dignity, about it being giving a sense of honor and all that kind of stuff. But as I've said, all of those arguments could just be self-deception. And why would we risk that? Why would we risk turning that into a broad phylactery or a long tassel? Just don't wear those things. Just dress normally. Dress like everybody else, and then there's no threat of sin here. When I read the story from Jesus here in Matthew, I just consider it a better idea to take that approach and not wear those special ministerial uniforms, to err on the side of caution in that way. So again, probably doesn't bother anyone here. Chad and I don't dress in any particular way, but for some Christians, that'd be like, ouch, why'd you say that? Well, I think it's a fair observation. Now, everything I've said so far as a way of application on this has been specifically about clothing and apparel, things that you wear on your body. But now, I would like to observe that the same self-exaltation can be practiced in other ways. So even though we're not talking about clothing and apparel anymore, we're actually talking about the same thing. So for example, I would like all of you, just humor me here, take your Bible and hold it up for me so I can see it. And if you use a phone, just hold up your phone there. Let's see. It's like, okay, you got Bibles. Well, those aren't Bibles. Let me show you a Bible. Here's a Bible. This is a Bible. I take the Word of God seriously. When you see me walking around with this, coming here every Sunday with my big Bible, here's a man who believes the Word of God, right? Now, what if I did that? What if I came in here every Sunday with the biggest possible Bible? I'm ready to study the Word of God. Like, show off, just showing off there. It's like, there's no reason to do that. This is just fine. I can follow along the sermon just well enough with this. But what would that be? I mean, you might say, well, it's a sign of his commitment, but really? That's a way to go about that, right? I mean, if you did that, so it's not clothing, right? It's not apparel. It's not something you wear on you, but it'd be the same thing as a broad phylactery or a long tassel. Also, imagine a situation more like this. And this is something that I thought of because years ago, apparently this person doesn't do this anymore, but I used to see this car driving around town, bright green, bright orange lettering with, Bible verses, Jesus saves, pay your tithes. You got to throw that in there, right? Pay your tithes. Just driving around in a car like that. Now, It's one thing to put a Jesus bumper sticker on your car, right? I mean, a lot of Christians do that. There's nothing especially holy or presuming about doing that. I mean, it's just a way to get people who are driving behind you thinking about eternal matters. But if you turn your car into a giant moving bumper sticker, a giant billboard for Jesus, that's really unusual. And it's the kind of thing that, again, gets you a level of notoriety beyond what other Christians are going to have. It comes across much the same way as wearing the broad phylactery, the long tassel, wearing a Christian t-shirt every day. Again, it's not something you wear on your person, it's not apparel, but it's something that's yours and it belongs to you and you're in it, your car, right? So that's another way that you might do this kind of thing, in a way that you'd be violating the spirit of what Jesus says here in his rebuke against the scribes and the Pharisees. I have a final example here. This might be another one where some Christians would certainly be uncomfortable with this, but think about Christian-themed tattoos. Okay? Now, I don't know if the trend still exists. I'm always behind the times, no matter what time it is. But it was common, many years ago at least, for zealous young Christians to get Christian tattoos. Very common, right? Now, the rightness of that practice, whenever that was discussed, whenever people were kind of debating that, they always make it a matter of, does the Bible allow tattoos? So basically, there's that passage back there in the Law of Moses about tattoos. There's one statement made by Paul that probably is not relevant, but people would talk about it anyway. So basically, two Bible passages, people would talk about that and say, hey, does the Bible allow us to get tattoos? And that's how they would talk about it. However, I've never heard anybody discussing that question bring this passage into the question, this stuff about the broad phylacteries and the long tassels. Because isn't it much the same thing? If I get the face of Jesus tattooed on this arm and a giant big cross tattooed on this arm, and I wear short sleeves all the time, that's going to be pretty noticeable. Even in a group of Christians, that's going to be pretty noticeable. I'm going to stand out from the crowd by my big Jesus tattoos. So isn't it really the same kind of thing as wearing a big phylactery? Isn't it the same kind of thing as driving a Jesus car? Isn't it much the same thing? Even though it's not clothing or apparel, but it's even more so, it's on your skin this time, and it's even worse because you can't get it off very easily. But isn't it much the same thing? These are all ways in which a person could fail in the same way that the scribes and the Pharisees failed and not realize it. Because again, there are arguments to be made. I'm doing this because of my devotion to God. I'm doing this so other people will think about their soul. And you can make those arguments, but it looks a lot like what the scribes and the Pharisees were doing, and Jesus rebuked them for that. And we could stay here and multiply examples. These are just the ones I thought of as being especially effective. But these are the kinds of things we need to think about. Before we do something that makes us stand out in the church crowd, let's remember the scribes and the Pharisees and how Jesus rebuked them, and not try to stand out in those kinds of ways among one another. Well, everything I've said so far is about what not to do, right? But there's more to it than this. The way Jesus ends this warning is an exhortation to something else, something better. Jesus goes further and replaces self-exaltation through clothing with something even better, and that is humble service. So in my last heading for today, I want to exhort you to seek exaltation through humble service, not through appearances, but through actually cultivating a sense of humility and service toward other people. Because this is how Jesus ends this warning. Let's read verses 11 through 12. He says, "But the greatest among you shall be your servant, and whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, whoever humbles himself shall be exalted." So according to Jesus, the only way up is down, right? If you want to be known as someone who is great, you actually have to do the opposite. You have to humble yourself and you have to serve other people. The only way you should ever seek any kind of exaltation is through humble service. Now, in this way, the disciples of Jesus can truly outdo the scribes and the Pharisees. They're the scribes and Pharisees trying to outdo other people with their broad phylacteries and their long tassels. But it's possible for disciples of Jesus to outdo them and everybody else in a very different way. See, Jesus has rebuked the scribes and the Pharisees for doing all their deeds to be noticed by men, to be thought well of among other people. Our own goal, first and foremost, should be the approval of God Himself. Just forgetting about other people for a moment, make sure you are pleasing to the Lord. And we do that naturally by cultivating humility so as to serve others. Humility is important because, after all, before God, humility is one of the major things. Before God, you ought to be humble. And as for serving others, it's just an application of the second greatest commandment, to love one another as you love yourself. And so to actually do things for them as you can. However, as we seek the approval of God in these ways, we're going to find ourselves outdoing the scribes and the Pharisees at their own game, and outdoing anyone who tries to exalt themselves through appearances only and through decoration. See, the scribes and the Pharisees want the approval of men, and maybe they get it, but only in this life. Only while they're walking around with their phylacteries and their tassels, their daily Christian t-shirts or their big Jesus cars or whatever. As they're doing those things, they may get notoriety, they may get respect, but only in this life. As soon as they die, those things don't matter anymore. Your clothing doesn't really matter after you're dead, or the things you do for appearance sake, those don't really matter. Meanwhile, those of us who seek to please God through humble service will also win the favor of anyone who is like God. The people of God, those who are seeking to make it their point in life to imitate God, if they're becoming like God, they're going to look well on other people who have humility and who have this servant attitude that is very much a crucial factor here in the Christian life. And so, you don't just win the favor of God, you win the favor of other people in that way, at least the people who matter, the people who are actually like God Himself in some way. And that favor lasts in eternity. Their good name will never die. The scribes and the Pharisees, who were they? We don't know many of their names. We know Nicodemus, and he became a Christian. These guys, they're dead, they're buried, they don't matter anymore. But for all eternity, we'll be with people, with one another, who have become like God and who have practiced humility and service. So our good name lasts forever. So we can actually outdo the scribes and the Pharisees at their own game, not by having a greater appearance, but by leaving all that aside and pursuing humble service to one another. Excuse me. Now, to accomplish this, we have no choice but to reject the quick and easy path to glory in favor of a life of labor. All right, so this is what it means. It sounds good when you talk about it, a good name that never dies and winning the favor of God. But what it means is rejecting the quick and easy path to glory and pursuing a life of labor. See, the quick and easy path to glory is through appearances. If you actually live the way that the scribes and the Pharisees did, or if you do any of the other things that I was talking about earlier, there's some glory there, and you can get it pretty quickly. You see, sight is the most compelling of our five senses. What we see is pretty much what we know. This is the way we talk about it. That's why we say things like, I'll believe it when I see it. And other examples like that. I'm from Missouri, so you have to show me. Anything like that, right? Similar expressions about the power of sight, of vision. And in addition to that, in addition to just the power of sight, people are very greatly affected by clothing and other matters of appearance. We have sayings about this too. We have sayings like the clothes make the man, and dress for the job you want, and all these other kinds of things about the importance of how you decorate yourself, basically. No matter how hard we try, we're going to judge the book by its cover. It's just the way we are. Sight is that compelling. Clothing and apparel, they matter that much to people. And with all those prejudices in place, a person can easily convince others that he is holy by the mere act of wearing something. If you really want the notoriety like the scribes and the Pharisees were trying to get, you can get it easily. Just put on something that makes you look holy, and people will think of you that way. But Jesus has taught us to do the opposite. He saw us to do the very opposite thing, that you, dressed normally, with nothing about your appearance to commend you, must strive for the kind of reputation befitting a child of God. And that's it. It's all about what you do and who you are, not what you wear and what you put on. Just you dressed normally, pursuing humble service. According to Jesus, that is the only way, to humble yourself so as to be a servant to others. Now, seeking honor in this way is a lifelong, laborious quest because it's not as easy as just putting something on. If you're going to do this, if you're going to actually live this life, people are not going to think as well of you as quickly as they would otherwise. Because let's face it, nobody notices a servant until the servant is gone. Once they realize everything this person was doing, how important this person was, just how much they actually did for other people, until that person's gone, no one really seems to notice those things. And in the meantime, they're not really shown proper gratitude. Being a servant is really, really hard. Being a humble servant, so that you're not seeking to get more attention out of anything, I mean, that's even harder, right? And yet, this is how it must be for anyone seeking true exaltation. It's not the quick and easy path to glory that you have through appearances, like the scribes and the Pharisees were doing. It's a life of labor. It's a hard way forward. But it's the way Jesus has given us, and it's the way he's told us to pursue the only kind of exaltation that matters. Now, thankfully, we know this works. We know this actually is worth something, and we know that because Christ himself has made it work for us. He's become an example of these things for us to follow. And to show you this, I have nothing better to say than what Paul has written over in Philippians chapter 2. And you can turn there if you like. I'm pretty much just going to read the passage. But Philippians chapter 2, one of these famous passages about the incarnation and the death of Christ and the resurrection of Christ, and basically about Christ, right? It's the life story, the eternal story of Jesus in just a few verses. Philippians 2, verses 3 through 13. So here's what Paul writes. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a bond servant, and being made in the likeness of men. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. For this reason also, God highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee will bow, of those who are in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and that every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So then, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. So Jesus had to suffer much as a humble servant before winning back his rightful name as Lord. I mean, he had equality with God from the very beginning. He gave all that up to become a humble servant. And he had to suffer much at that time in his life. But he did receive back his name, Lord. He got it back. And 2,000 years later, no one has managed to rob him of that name, right? Not all the skeptics, the heretics, the tyrants, the persecutors, apostates, whatever. We still call Jesus Lord. And we're going to keep calling him Lord. And for all eternity, we're going to be calling him that. Those in heaven, those on the earth, those under the earth, it doesn't matter. Jesus is Lord, no doubt about it. And Jesus accomplished all of this, by the way, without having the power of appearances. And I have another passage to read to you about that. You don't have to go to this one, but this is from Isaiah, one of these prophetic descriptions of the Messiah. Listen to what it says here. This is Isaiah 53, verse 2, describing the Messiah. He grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of parched ground. He had no stately form or majesty that we should look upon him, no appearance that we should be attracted to him. He doesn't have the power of appearances. If you had seen Jesus walking around, he would not have looked as impressive as the scribes and the Pharisees, or as impressive as anyone. He would have looked like a guy, just a guy walking around doing stuff. And yet Christ overcame all of that and won back the name Lord purely through being a humble servant, through serving others and humbling himself while doing so. So if it's a good name you want, especially if you want it to come from God, this humble service to others is the sure way to get it. Jesus has shown us that. He's modeled it for us. He's gone this way. Yes, a long, hard road to this kind of exaltation, but it is possible. Christ has done it, and if we follow him on the same road, we will get it. So that is what you ought to be doing. Rather than trying to exalt yourself through appearances, you should be humbling yourself and serving others like Christ. And that is what I mean by exaltation without decoration. So that is what I had to say to you today. Let me give you a summary, and then we'll move on here to the next part of our meeting. So according to Jesus, main point for today, we should seek exaltation not through appearances, but through humble service to one another. And my outline had 4 headings. First, Jesus rebuked the scribes and the Pharisees for seeking exaltation through religious apparel. They did it through broad phylacteries and long tassels, and Christ rebuked them for that. In my second heading, I made the point that we should not bother defending our own overuse of religious apparel. It's something we might do. We might genuinely feel that we do our things that we do for a good reason. But the scribes and the Pharisees also felt that way, and Jesus was not at all impressed by anything they might have had to say about it. He just rebuked them and moved on. And we should take that to heart as we think about our own religious apparel. That leads into our third heading, that none of us should seek to appear more righteous than another through how we decorate ourselves. Whatever it may be, whatever the clothing may be, or objects we carry, or those kinds of things, we should not seek to appear more righteous than everyone else. We should seek to just blend in with the crowd in terms of how we look. And instead of doing all those things that the scribes and Pharisees were doing, my fourth point for today, we should seek exaltation through humble service. We've seen Christ do it, and it works. Even though it is a very long and difficult way to live, it is nonetheless the way to seek the only kind of exaltation that matters. So as a closing thought for you in all of that, I mentioned earlier in this sermon and also last time that these later rabbis after the time of Jesus at least saw the point Jesus was trying to make with regard to the broad phylacteries and the long tassels of the scribes and the Pharisees. They came in here and said, okay, look, we can't have all of you trying to show off through these things. Just wear the same thing. Wear the same phylactery, wear the same tassels. Don't try to impress each other through what you're wearing. So please, just thinking about that, let's not be less diligent about these things than people who consider Jesus an enemy, right? Because even though they saw the point of what Jesus was saying eventually, that doesn't mean they became Christians, right? They're still very much unbelievers when it comes to Jesus and the gospel. But here we are, we're Christians. I mean, we're trying to follow Jesus. This is a big point. I mean, this is who we are. We are Christians. So let's not be less zealous than those later rabbis. Let's actually take this to heart. Let's remember this. Let's think about the things we wear and the things we do and leave off all of this trying to impress people through appearances, and let's just focus on humility and service. Okay, well that's all I had to say for today, and that's all I have to say about clothing and apparel and those kinds of things. Next time we'll press forward into other ways that these men exalted themselves and other ways that we can pursue humble service as taught by Jesus. So that's all we'll be doing next time whenever I teach next. Are there questions or comments on any of this?